The best of Money Matters. The Big Story.
Welcome to The Big Story. I'm Hongbin Jeong. A new task force to support businesses and workers will be formed in response to U.S. President Donald Trump's announcement of a suite of universal tariffs, including a 10% on Singapore, which will take effect on April 9th today. Now, the task force, chaired by Deputy Prime Minister Yong, will include representatives from Singapore's economic agencies, the Singapore Business Federation, the Singapore National Employers Federation, and the National Trades Union Congress. Prime Minister Lawrence Wong says the new task force aims to help businesses and workers address immediate uncertainties and better adapt to the new economic environment. So how will this national task force support businesses and workers? Well, joining us today is Dr Alan Chong, who's a senior fellow at the Rajaratnam School of International Studies. Hello, Dr. Chong. Welcome to the show.
Welcome. Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much for joining us. Dr. Chong, now the government is no stranger to forming task forces in response to dealing with critical national emergencies from, SARS to COVID, etc. in the past. Why is there a specific need for a task force to be formed this time round, and what does it imply about the gravity of this tariff situation?
Singapore has not faced this degree of all-rounded economic threat for some time. So if you look back at the specifics of the announcement by the White House about universal tariffs applied across the board, with the minimum being 10%, Singapore falls into this minimum category. And given our status as open economy, and a small open economy at that, that's trading with the world, 10% tariff already means quite a bit of tax, an additional tax, if you want to call it that, on our exports. And our exports are not strictly completely produced here. All right, we're taking other people's semi-finished goods or raw materials and re-exporting it to other people. So this 10% should be sufficient cause for worry to set up a task force. And you have to understand that there are lots of knock-on effects, which I believe various ministers, including the Prime Minister's speech in Parliament yesterday, highlighted.
Right.
Knock-on effects take place in terms of how our trading partners who produce either these semi-finished goods, finished goods, or raw materials through us to other countries will have to add on all these taxes. So officially, we are under 10%, the lowest of them all. But the knock-on effects could well mean substantial hit, all right, on various sectors, including the logistics sector. And of course, logistics in Singapore's case means shipping, the airlines, even cargo trucks, all right, and other kinds of companies that even manage the back end of these logistics operations.
Well, Dr. Chong, then, is this formation of a national task force going to create further panic for the public, or will it have the opposite effect? I mean, DPM Gan did say transparency is a key focus of the tariff task force.
I shouldn't think that it will create panic. I think most of your listeners going to be reading lots of background news, either through their handphones, their computers, smart devices, and so on. So they will actually take what they hear on your channel in consideration with whatever else they're reading. And I suspect that the organizational advantage of having a task force is that it brings together all the important stakeholders within Singapore Inc. I mean, Singapore is often described by foreign analysts as operating almost like a company that has various parts as well as its partners coming together frequently, talk about how best to work together cohesively to the point where everybody has a stake in the pie of growing wealth. And in this case, of course, everybody's bread and butter is being affected. Whether you're in the banking sector, you're in the manufacturing, or you're in the utilities processing sector, you're all going to be affected. So I think the creation of this task force is an important confidence booster, and it shows that the government is taking seriously the implications of this tariff war.
I mean, a major focus of the task force will be engaging the private sector to better understand the concerns and challenges. So what role will the private sector play in the task force's efforts, you think? I mean, what kind of input is the task force looking for from businesses?
I would second guess things like government panelists would ask the private sector if they've got suggestions or other kinds of ready measures in terms of trying to cut costs. You see, let's just talk about 10%. Now, 10% compared to what the other economies targeted by the United States is faring is considered a win. I mean, it's awkward using this term, but it is a relative win compared to certain other economies that the United States is targeting with levies of 15% and upwards. So for private sector companies, I would guess that one immediate possible measure is to try to cut costs by this commensurate 10%. If you can cut your existing costs down to 90%, the additional 10% will mean status quo. All right, that's one immediate measure that some companies can take, but not all can do so, especially if they're locked into long-term contracts with very specific price points. Then they can't possibly do that. But what they can do is perhaps help shave costs on the logistics front. Now, the logistics industry is going to be one of the worst hit immediately, because if people who are manufacturing the goods and the services that need to be sent out from the various points in Singapore are no longer going to project forward orders, then, they have to find a way to lure these users of their logistics services back by offering discounts. Or they could say, I'll help you cut costs by not using the more expensive options. I mean, air transport is usually the most expensive option for physical bulk transport. Okay, we've got cargo planes that are very large these days. And, a lot of the Boeing 747s, which have been retired from passenger service, are still flying the skies, all right, for cargo. And these can still take bulk. But the problem is, if you add whatever tariffs that are levied by the Trump administration onto air cargo, it's terribly expensive. So what they can do is they'll offer cut rate services on ships. And of course, there are still plenty of excess carrying capacity on ships. And ships, of course, can offer competitive rates in terms of whether you're prepared to accept their multi-port sailing plans, or do you want the most direct point? Because if you want the most direct point, chances are your cost will go up. So there are all these things that the shipping companies can think of. And those companies based in Singapore that are exporting through China or exporting in partnership with Chinese companies to Europe, for instance, they can still take advantage of the other land routes. Okay, this is something that I think a lot of manufacturers will be looking at. Okay, the land routes from China to Europe, for instance, are part of this so-called Belt and Road infrastructure. And there is now in existence this Trans-Asian Railway that connects all the major cities in China, going through Central Asia, avoiding Ukraine, obviously, and into Europe.
I see. Well, given that many businesses are still uncertain about their next moves, though, how effective do you think this approach will be?
Again, you see that there needs to be a lot of consultation, and that's the purpose of task force, because it brings all the important players together. And here is where, government and the various business federations or chambers of commerce need to be talking to one another. And of course, they have to bring in the trade unions as well. Can workers accept temporary cuts in wages, for instance? All right. So these emergency measures may need to be taken. And those of us who were looking for some kind of bonus later this year may well have to be psychologically prepared to forego that under current emergency circumstances.
Well, the 10% universal tariff imposed by the U.S. appears non-negotiable. I mean, PM Wong warned that Singapore's growth could be significantly affected, possibly prompting a revision of the 2025 GDP forecast, currently at 1% to 3%. Singapore may or may not enter a recession this year. So, Dr. Chong, is there a likelihood that a recession could happen, and how bad of a recession? I mean, could it echo the financial crisis of 1997 and 2008?
There's always a possibility, but as I've been telling several other people who have discussed this matter with me, we need to look for all the silver linings that, Singapore has built in or set in place during the pandemic. And people should not forget that Singapore is intimately intertwined with this regional cooperative economic partnership, RCEP. It is one of the biggest free trade areas in the world, and it includes China and Japan, plus all of ASEAN, most of East Asia, plus Australia and New Zealand. So that is something that will be an important anchor and a temporary substitute for the US market. I've also taken to pointing out to those who ask me, about putting US tariffs in perspective. In Singapore's case, and of course I can't speak for the rest of the RCEP countries, in Singapore's case alone, the United States is our third largest trading partner. Yes, that would make the tariffs a hit on Singapore's economy, but do not forget, our two biggest trading partners are actually China and Malaysia. All right.
Right. I mean, then what does this mean for Singaporeans? How worrying is this for younger Singaporeans who might not have felt the impact from earlier recessions?
Well, those who have gone through earlier recessions would realize that they have, what you call important precedents to rely on, in the sense that we have gotten through worse. Those of us who are old enough might remember the oil crisis of 1973-75. Now, that was even worse, I would think, because Singapore was independent for barely a decade, and then we got hit by all these, events from the Middle East. It was basically the Middle East oil producers trying to get back at Western economies. And, we got through that. And then, of course, there was the 82-83 recession, followed a few years later by another one. We got through it. And of course, I think the next worst was the Asian financial crisis.
Well, PM Wong mentioned that the outward-oriented sectors will bear the brunt of the impact due to weaker global growth. Could you help us elaborate on how sectors like manufacturing and wholesale trade are particularly vulnerable here?
Wholesale trade definitely will be affected because we are a major import-export center. That has been our historic role since British times. And there's a limit at the moment as to how far they can cut costs just to accommodate this additional 10% tariff. And this is why the task force is important. It brings together all kinds of businesses that are supplying goods at the intermediate stage, supplying goods at the finished stage. So all these should talk to one another and think about ways to slash costs. So I think that's going to be how the wholesale trade sector is going to react. The energy sector, I don't know. I don't know how you're going to cut costs because ships have certain ranges of rates. And I think tanker traffic is already under immense stress from events in the Middle East long before Trump came into office. And I would think that they can still think of ways and means to slash costs. And Singapore may still turn the corner on this by offering perhaps certain energy companies that want to transport petroleum, from the Middle East through Singapore to the rest of East Asia. Perhaps we might encourage them to refine more of the petroleum here, all right, because we've got a large number of refineries here before shipping it back home. And that could cut costs a bit. Okay, by how much, I don't know. And that's why the task force is convening.
I mean, this year's budget 2025 also includes measures like the CDC and SG60 vouchers, as well as the Skills Future support. In your opinion, Dr. Chong, how effective will these short-term support measures be for workers and businesses? I mean, will it also be effective in, buffering the economic effects of the tariffs on Singaporean families?
Yes, all these measures will help, but I would also hazard a guess that at some point, the task force might also recommend a temporary suspension of the last two increases of the GST. Okay, that could help tremendously as well. All right. Again, the government will have, all the statistics at their disposal. Other things they might cut would be to go back to the playbook of the 1980s recessions, where they cut the Central Provident Fund rate contributions. Okay, that will also help businesses. They could also encourage certain customer-facing businesses to cut service charge. That could also help, and so on.
Right. Well, PM Wong also mentioned Singapore will strengthen its collaboration with other like-minded countries and focus on the ASEAN bloc. Should Singapore focus more on strengthening regional ties within ASEAN as part of its strategy to weather the economic or the global economic storm, or should it prioritize diversifying its trade partnerships outside of ASEAN?
I would think that everybody has to work together to weather this very difficult period. As I've suggested early on, to keep your customer base and to keep them optimistic about continuing to put in their orders and to buy and to sell, you need to rearrange your costs around this 10%. That is talking about the Singapore case alone. Now, if you look across ASEAN, Trump has hit our less developed ASEAN neighbors with far higher tariffs. All right, and that's very concerning to Singapore because if you look at the supply chains on any number of products, including basic things like furniture, the furniture that we all buy from the stores here in Singapore, there is a 90% chance that they're all made in the ASEAN countries, all right, before they are sent to Singapore for sale. So if you think about something as elementary as that, we cannot sit smugly and say, thank goodness we're only at 10% and the rest are above that. No, okay, we'll be affected. And we have to somehow work together as ASEAN to find a way to nullify the severity of this 10% tariff, at least in Singapore's case. And in their cases, the other ASEAN countries' cases, they will also have to find ways, right, to accommodate this extraordinarily artificial cost factor, all right? And as I said, because we're so intertwined with the entire wider East Asian, Northeast Asian region, we have to work together. And I suppose one way is to diversify trade. Okay, suppliers and consumers may have to adjust their mindsets in the direction of buying more from countries within these so-called protected areas, meaning the free trade agreements that we have with all these countries, rather than buying or selling to the United States. Of course, we cannot decouple from the United States completely. It's just that we can make certain decisions such that we will shift slightly away from the United States, and that will help. With Europe, again, the Europeans, I think, very concerned about this as well. And, we already have frameworks like the Asia-Europe meeting, which can be expanded easily within weeks, all right, into a full-scale economic dialogue. And I think the Europeans are equally concerned. They probably are thinking the same. For as long as Trump is in office, perhaps we need to sell more to Asia to mitigate this impact. And of course, I read interesting stories around the world's newspapers suggesting that the wine industry is in a very severe pickle. It started in January when Trump said, I'm going to target wines from Europe. All right. So if European wines are too expensive for Americans, the next possible large middle class market they can think of to buy their wines would be Asia.
Right.
All right. So there's all the more reason for Singapore to talk to its Asian partners, to talk to its European partners and say, let's divert some aspects of our trade relations towards ourselves for the moment.
Right. Well, with all that being said, given the challenges of the new economic environment brought about by tariffs, is there a silver lining to all of this?
The silver lining would be that we would be compelled to look at new opportunities with, our nearest partner or towards underappreciated partners. Do not forget that we have not reached out to countries in the African continent yet, all right? And there is a middle class there, if you look beyond the headlines. And I think Singaporeans have yet to tap that market. And then further afield in America's backyard, so-called America's backyard, is South America. We haven't fully exploited that. And, our other mega FTA, the CPTPP, includes a good number of large middle-class driven economies in South America. And those are, again, underexplored partners and markets that we should be looking at more closely because of the Trump tariffs.
Some great insights from you there. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Chong, for your time and your insights today.
You're welcome.
That was Dr. Alan Chong, who is the Senior Fellow at the S. Rajaratnam School of International Studies. This has been The Big Story with me, Hongbin Jeong.
To listen to more great interviews, download our podcasts at audio.sg or download the audio app. That's AWEDIO, audio at the App Store and Google Play.